Um, there's a lot of fear that people have that their
Mm,
network is too small or that other
mm,
people know that their network is too small. And so that is like, it's a very common thing. But most people have no idea what your social life actually looks like. People tend to have, different friendship groups, people that don't do everything together. And so
mm.
just because you only have, two friends that you hang out with for the majority of your university time does not mean that you don't have this really big network elsewhere. And so I think people like struggle to think of what other people think of them, and that, if you lack friends or if that you're more of a loner or introvert type, that people are judging you for it. But like, especially in today's world where we have so many online relationships and people that we communicate with not face to face, like it's only the tip of the iceberg. You really have no idea what someone's social life looks like.
Welcome everyone. We're doing a webinar here for You Belong, and I'm here with my guest, Dr. Emily Long. We're going to be talking about social networks as we move to university. I'll just say a quick word about You Belong. You Belong is a national campaign looking to improve belonging and connection for university students, especially through the transition to university. We're a group of researchers interested in understanding social connection and belonging. And over the summer, we've been working with a fantastic student team to pull together a toolkit of resources to help students at universities right across the UK think about how they find connection, how they find their place at university. Emily is part of that team, and I'm going to be chatting to her a little bit today to find out a bit more about what she knows, what we know about how our friendship networks change as we move to university. Hi, Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Emily, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yep. So I'm Emily Long. I'm a researcher at the University of Glasgow. My background is in psychology. Actually, all of my degrees are in psychology. But I'm not that interested in clinical psychology, and I'm actually interested in the way that relationships relate to health. And so, yeah, so for the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at young people's health, not just university students, but people in high schools, secondary schools, basically anyone between ages like 10 and 25 or so. And I have been investigating how their social lives are related to their health and their health choices.
Fascinating. Um, I should say as a researcher, I'm interested in public health. So I like thinking about the big picture things that help us look after our mental health. So there's a nice connection here between Emily and I. But at this point, I need to confess that I don't have any of the statistical and scientific expertise that Emily has around social networks. So I'm going to be, as a novice, trying to grill her a little bit today to find out a bit more about what we know about how our friendship groups change as we move through life, really. So Emily, I'm going to ask you a bit more about social network analysis, and we'll get into that. But before we get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of what it is that you do, can I ask you to give us a flavour for why you're interested in social connection for university students?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'm interested in social connections for university students because university is inherently supposed to be this really social process for people. So you go from this life that you knew before, and then you're just thrust into this entirely new environment surrounded by new adults, new peers, new experiences, new opportunities. Um, and sometimes those relationships really flourish and grow and develop and you're really happy, and other times they don't go in that way. And so I think social connection, though like the university or college experience, people tend to talk about like academics and what job are you going to get and what profession are you going to have, there's this whole underlying like social element to it. And so I guess I kind of came to student mental health and student social connection from the perspective of this being a social ecosystem that people are placed into and they have to find their footing in some way.
You said two really interesting things to me there. So, I mean, You Belong has been running for nearly 2 years now, and we're saying that students are being placed into this social ecosystem. Is it a functional one? Does I guess you could, by saying it's a social ecosystem, you're sort of implying that there is a social life to be had there. Is it a system that is supportive of student social life?
Well, I think it can be, but I think we don't actually understand the extent to which the ecosystem, as I'm calling it, actually supports students. So I guess when I'm talking about an ecosystem, I mean like you're placed in a residence halls, you have people that you have to interact with, you go to classes, you have to interact with people. Presumably you have relationships from your old life, your parents, your family, whatever, that you have to keep afloat as well. And so like they're, whether you're developing friends and having the time of your life or not, like there are relationships there at university that you have to navigate. You have to navigate coursework with people, you have to navigate living with people you've maybe never lived with someone before other than a sibling or something. So that's, I guess, what I'm thinking of as the ecosystem of just like the relationships that exist to keep universities there. But then there's also, as you're saying, like the social life part of it, and people, myself included, when I went to university, like anticipating this really rich, vibrant social experience, where you're going to meet, like your best friends that you'll have for the rest of your life, and you're always going to be doing things. And sometimes that's true, but there are also students who that isn't true at all. And so actually like the system is set up in a way that some people really benefit and some people fall through the cracks. And I'm interested in figuring out like for whom does the current system work, and how can we better support people so that everyone gets to access this fun, vibrant social environment.
Thank you, Emily. And actually, I was quite thinking about the ecosystem as you first described it, because you're thinking there, it almost sounds like you said have to a lot. There are people you have to engage with, you have to connect with, you have to navigate these relationships. And from some of the work we've done with You Belong so far, talking to students about their experiences at university, that seems to be one of the things that stands out as a contrast from school, that actually there seems to be a lot less of the have to. At school, it was really tight. That if we take your word ecosystem, that felt really tightly scaffolded. I don't know why, but I'm now thinking of fish in a coral reef, right? And the coral reef at school was really densely packed. So you really had to negotiate and speak to and connect with those people around you. And it feels like at university we've gone something quite a lot looser, where the have to feels like actually if I opt not to, we might survive. Which feels, it sounds to me from what we're hearing from students, that's really quite a challenging change.
Yeah, I mean, so I could see that definitely. I think also like from my accent that I did not go to university in the UK. And so in the US, like you are forced into a social environment in your dorm where you have a roommate. Like you do not live alone. You live with someone.
We do that.
Yeah, so sometimes you live with like 3 or 4 people. Sometimes you live in like this little house of like 8 people. So you are forced to interact with these people, whether you want to or not. So I guess like that's what I'm falling back on in these like forced interactions. But I still would argue that you're going to classes, you're going to various things where you have people that you still have to like understand social cues from and understand how to interact together in the shared environment of university, but definitely less so than secondary school, where like, yeah, you are constrained to like your little group that you would hang out with or that you have the access to, where then you go to university and suddenly like doors are open and you have so many more people that you could choose from that you want to interact with. And so, yeah, I can see how balancing like a prescribed social environment of secondary school compared to a more loose, like, the world is your oyster. You can make university what you want it to be, experience to be kind of unsettling for people as they try to navigate that difference.
I'm noticing with the oysters, we're really under the sea today. I think that might be the rain that's going on outside.
Well, actually, my like team's background before this was an under the sea environment, but I changed it. I changed it right before this because I just wasn't sure how that would go down.
Oh, brilliant. So I know it's early days of You Belong in really looking at the social network bits, but what do you know? What do you think we already know about how networks might change as people move to university?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think intuitively, like just when you think about the university experience, you know that there will be change in networks, right? Like the friends that you had before might not be the same friends that you have at university, or maybe some of them will stay there and some of them will be new people that you meet at university.
Mm.
So I think like intuitively, without any research, without any evidence, we can just say that there is this big change when people go to university.
I've been struck with some of the focus group data that we've had for You Belong, where students have been reflecting that actually they didn't expect that change. They thought,
Really?
I've got a really good network of friends at home. I'm just going to keep up with that network. I don't really need to make new friends at university. I'm going to sustain that network. And that hasn't worked.
Yeah.
That you have a lot of conviction that things can stay as they are, but it's really hard to sustain that when sort of everything else around changes.
Yeah. Well, and I think that like so in my world of social network research, there's a lot of evidence around life changes.
Mm.
So like transitional periods of life. So moving from secondary school into university, moving from university into employment, moving from like a partnership into family life, moving from a job to retirement, later life transitions, like all of these key transitions that relationships change, like whether you want them to or not, they change. And I think again intuitively it has a lot to do with like your frame of reference changes. So you might have, you know, your group of five really good friends from secondary school, but if you each then transition into a new phase of life where like maybe you went to university, someone is in a job, someone moved to go to university, like you each are experiencing different things, and it's really hard to keep a relationship going when you're experiencing, you know, different parts of life. And so I think that yeah. So I'm wondering in your focus groups if those are students who didn't move for university, like
I think
yeah,
predominantly, yes, they haven't
yeah,
moved. They've stayed and they've been commuting to university. And yet, although they haven't moved, as you're saying, their life has changed
yeah,
but what you're doing changes. And it feels like it tells me something about however much we feel our friends are our friends because we like them and we care about them and we value them. Actually, quite often our friends are also there because of proximity and the things we share in common and the things we do together. And when we stop doing that, it does become harder to sustain friendships. Am I making
definitely.
that up?
No, you're not making that up. I mean, there's lots of social network studies that would show that exact thing, that we tend to be friends with people who are very similar to us, to people who do the same things as us, that live close to us. And so then the second you're going to university and they're not, or you've moved and you're slightly apart, or you're just in these different like life phases, and suddenly those, you know, like natural tendencies for people to be friends are kind of frayed in some way. So it doesn't even have to be a reflection of the relationship or of the relationship not being good to begin with, or like, you know, I mean, yes, it's growing apart when you know, kind of like distance yourself from a friend, but I think it's a very natural response
Mm,
when you go to university to not have the same relationship that you had with your friends from your previous life.
yeah.
And I think
So,
also this would be a good time to bring up my favorite theory of human
okay.
relationships. So the social convoy model of relationships.
So hang on, this isn't Emily's own theory, right?
No, no,
This is
no.
a genuine real theory. This
This
isn't
is a
just
real
something you've
theory.
made up.
This is a real theory. So social convoy, and the reason the reason I like it so much is because there's a song, like this really terrible old American like country song thing about a convoy. And in your free time, just Google it, or maybe I'll put it into the link because it's really funny. And every time I think of social convoy theory, I think of this song, and it's amazing. It'll give you a glimpse into American culture. But anyway, so social convoy theory is this idea that we have a convoy of people, so like a little group of people throughout our entire lives that like move with us throughout different periods of life. And so the idea is that the convoy largely stays the same throughout your entire life, but the people in the convoy can change. So an example would be like if in your university years, for example, you tend to be more of an introvert, you really like just a couple close, intimate relationships, you have 2 or 3 really good friends, you're not a big crowd person, then in your mid 20s, you're likely to also have a social network that reflects that of, just a couple close, intimate relationships. And at every period throughout your life, you're likely to have the same sort of relationships versus, you're big crowd person, you have 20 best friends, big dinner parties, all of that. So we each kind of have our own like convoy that we develop and that we feel best with, and people play different roles in it. So if you're someone who never has a best friend, for example, and you always just have like a couple people that you hang out with, but having deep, meaningful relationships doesn't matter that much to you, then throughout your life, you're going to have research would show that throughout your life, you will have similar sorts of relationships. And so again, people come and go and they fill different roles for you, but the like the structure of that social life around you largely stays the same. So you have this convoy throughout your whole life.
Emily, that's making me think that, is there something here in sort of predicting who might find perhaps the move to university from a social perspective a bit more challenging or difficult by looking at their past convoy, in that if there's sort of a general feel at university that you have lots of friends and it's very busy and noisy, you could look at actually your track record of your convoy before university and maybe just perhaps mindfully stop and reflect that it's likely to be the same at university, or that's where you're likely to feel most comfortable. So it's not realistic to go, actually, I'm going to be happy if I have tons of friends, if that hasn't been your history. Is that so?
Yeah, definitely.
You're trying to tell us it's not easy to change how we have friendships.
No, and I think, I mean, the other thing you have to like, so people are still developing and figuring out like what they like in life during the years of, well, if you're a traditional student going to university at 17, 18. So like your convoy and your preference for the type of convoy you're going to have is still developing at that stage. So I don't think it would be necessarily abnormal for someone to go from a small close-knit secondary school group of friends into this big social environment and actually really thrive. I think that that's just part of like developing your preferences during that age group. But yes, I do think there's a lot of value in thinking about particularly
what are your preferences.
Yeah. Like if you're a student and you're wondering why it's not, the time of your life at university and you're not having the best time, like spending some time thinking about like, well, what are the meaningful relationships to me? What do I need from people? Do I need that big social environment or not? And thinking about like what worked for you in the past, I think can be helpful in realizing that not everyone needs to go to university and have 20 best friends that you do everything with. Like that to me personally would be exhausting. I don't like, that's not my convoy at all. But for me, it took me a while to realize that wasn't my convoy. Like I didn't need to place myself in those situations where I felt like I had to be that big, like extroverted, party person. Like that wasn't working for me. So finding my smaller, nice little quiet convoy like took some time, but it matches better with my preferences, which I'm sure many students can speak to.
Indeed. I'm sorry, I'm doing far too much thinking about my own life there, and that's not what we're here for. Emily, we've talked a lot. So you've brought in theory here with the social convoy, but we've talked a little bit sort of in and out that you do social network analysis and you're looking at social networks. What do we mean by a social network? What is your social network?
Yeah, I mean, so there's not one definition of a social network. I think like for me, when I'm thinking of social networks or, generally the field of social network analysis, it's the like patterns of social relationships between people. So people tend to think of social networks as like social media, and it's not social media. It's not like how popular you are on TikTok or whatever. You could have a network of online things like how many people you have on TikTok and how many people you interact with, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like human relationships that can be in person or online, however you function, but people that are like your social life. That would be your social network. So sometimes those are people who you're forced, like we were talking about earlier, forced to interact with. It could be, your siblings or whoever ends up in that like forced network category. But then it's also people that you choose to spend your time with, that you choose to relate to. So it's kind of like putting like you at the center of a circle, and then thinking of like all the little dots of the people in your life that you're connected to.
Mm. And it seems very much as we're thinking about people moving to university that for many, that word choice is new, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I like your distinction of sort of forced or friends that people that you've chosen to put in the network. And that seems to sort of be the first time for many for many young people, the move to university is the first time they've really felt they've had a choice over who's in the network.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big thing to be thinking about, who I'm choosing to spend time with.
Yeah, well, and like before we started this webinar, we were talking about Freshers Week, and the idea that like in Freshers Week, you meet all of these people, and you're like forced into the social environment, right? Where you have all these opportunities to meet people. And then at the end of Freshers Week, I know that there's this sentiment of like, well, those are my people. Now I'm forced to have those people be my friends throughout the rest of university, because I've lost the opportunity to find other people and meet other people. And that's not true, but I know that that's like the sentiment of you
categorically not true. It's not true.
No, it's not true at all. But like it is. I think it's right. Yeah, it's right to say that like it's challenging then once people have kind of developed their little groups of friends, or friends maybe at the end of Freshers Week, your friends, that then when you realize that those aren't the people that you want to be spending your time with, they don't have the same values as you don't have the same interests as them, or you're just not quite like comfy with them, that then finding your people, or even knowing that you have a choice and you don't have to hang out with them, you don't have to make them your best friends, can be something that's totally new. And the students can feel really ill-equipped to like, how do you distance yourself from a relationship, or how do you reach out to new people if you've missed that window of Freshers Week?
Sorry, we're recording this very shortly after Dame Maggie Smith died, and I've just got a clip of her in the back of my mind saying it's very easy to avoid people you don't like, but avoiding your friends, now that's the tricky one. How do you lose these people?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people do that after Freshers Week. Is there is then a process of going, I have a network that I'm not very fond of. How do I reconfigure this?
Yeah.
Is there research from other times of life that you've looked at that tells us how people, are there any lessons we can learn about navigating those sort of transitions where big changes happen in our social network?
I mean, so kind of. So if you look at transitions of like people going through big, sometimes even like traumatic life changes, like bereavement or things like that, when your really close core network kind of like comes to your rescue and really supports you, and you have more like peripheral relationships that maybe aren't that supportive, or aren't what you need, they kind of drift away over time. And so I think that, yeah, I guess the like the thought behind that is that you have like everyone needs relationships, whether you think you need relationships or not. We're social humans. And so like I would not argue that if you find yourself after Freshers Week with people that you don't want to be spending your time with, that you then just decide like, that's me, I'm done, I'm not going to socialize anymore. But if you try to focus on finding those couple like core network people who you really do relate to on some deeper level, that then kind of letting the wider ones drift away is totally fine. It happens in other phases of life and people get over it. You don't have to like worry too much about hurting people's feelings, because these things happen repeatedly over life. And like, yeah, I think just the idea that networks change, it's totally normal, and not to like invest yourself too much in relationships that just aren't sustaining you.
And with that change, Emily, I'm thinking back to the idea of those people that have sort of said, well, it's not going to change, and I've got a network of people I value and I appreciate, and I don't need new people. Are there things we know that people can do to sustain members of their network when there's a lot of change going on? Are there things we know that help? Or are we sort of, is that like
that's
just
like a bit out
fighting
of,
to hold the tide back? Whereas no, it's out of your,
I was gonna say, like, so that kind of that affective, like,
yes.
Yeah, so that side of relationships, I would say I've investigated less in my actual research.
Okay.
But in research that I've done, where you look at like relationships that are stable over time, so relationships
Yeah.
that
So what
stay
does
with
stay?
you,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, but it always comes down to like how close you are to the person, how often you speak to
Well,
them.
that's a big thing of finding time to speak, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
putting
Like
the
I think
time in to speak,
yeah,
to
so
catch
again,
up.
they're the very like kind of obvious sort of things. Like you have to talk to people and you have to have some level of emotional closeness with them. Otherwise, those relationships, unless they're, your family, which is probably always going to be there to a certain
I know
extent.
you say you have to, that it's obvious you have to talk, but so here's me, that I'm very good at being a bit socially anxious and a little bit neurotic, and I'm quite good if people haven't phoned me for a while or messaged, I kind of go, well, they don't really want to talk to me. It's taken me a lot of years of training of going, no, everyone has busy lives as well, Nicola. Why don't you reach out and you phone or you check in with them? But it can be really hard to do that, I think, when you sort of it's really obvious you have to talk, but when everyone's lives are really busy, it can be quite easy to drift without any meaning or intention, right?
Yeah, and then I think also to like overinterpret drift. So
But yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, to
My
overinterpret and be
speciality.
like, oh, they're mad at me or they don't care or whatever. But it's actually like exactly like you said, they're busy, you're busy, lives move on, you're in different phases. So I think, yes, sustaining relationships, especially those that like didn't come to university with you. So your old network, like yeah, putting in the effort and trying to talk to people. Because yeah, like our research always just shows that it's people that you consider to be like very core to your network that stay with you. And then the more like, these are friends, so we don't do everything together and they're not that important. Like they change as they should across your life. So like losing those relationships, I presume, does not impact you in the same way as losing like your very, very core best pals.
Gosh. Emily, I'm looking at the clock and thinking we should wrap up here. This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm just wondering before we wrap up, whether there's anything else you think we should think about or you'd like to share about helping students move to university or settle at university. Is there anything else from your research that you think would be worth thinking about?
Well, I think so. In terms of You Belong, we're just starting to look at the social network data, and so I guess maybe just sharing for a couple of minutes about what we've found in that data would be
That would be
useful.
brilliant.
And it's all very preliminary, and so bear that in mind. But so what we did is we looked at people's social networks before they came to university. Well, we asked them to reflect on who was part of their network before they came to university, and then to do the same thing while at university to tell us like who they're interacting with, who's important to them. And so we can cross compare the two networks. And generally we found that the networks like grow slightly when someone comes to university. So they introduce slightly more people to their network, which would make sense because as we're talking about, you're in courses with a lot of people, you potentially have moved there and have people that you're forced to interact with, but other people. So it's just this big like boom where there's a very slight increase in the size of the network. So I think it's about 1/4 of students report that no one from their network before university changed coming into university. But 75% of students are saying that some of those relationships that they had in secondary school or the summer before university, they since have lost, that those relationships are just not part of their present life. So 75% of students experience that sort of change. In terms of adding new relationships to university, adding new relationships when you move to university, I cannot remember exactly what it was. I think most students, like a vast majority, had at least a couple new relationships that they considered to be new to their network. And
it's interesting,
but also,
you're reflecting there on the lower end. So, and you're always talking about sort of a slight change. Did did you have many students or many participants who'd picked up a lot of new people, or does that just doesn't really? Okay.
So what I was going to say is there's a broad spectrum. So most people, well, I mean, this is how averages work, right? Like most people have a moderate amount of change. There are a few people who have like zero change whatsoever, and then some people who have this crazy amount of change. But when we're talking, so what you do there, if you're looking at like this spectrum of numbers, you ignore people who have these extreme things and you focus on the group in the middle. But I think it just in looking at our data, there were people who had, you know, like 4 people in their network total. So like 4 people that they interact with or have some sort of like communication with. And then there were people who had, you know, 40, 50 people in their network. And so I do think that that speaks a little bit to the social convoy stuff of just like preference for how many people are in your life. Like I would never have 50 people that I would put in my life. But I probably also wouldn't have 4. I'd be somewhere more in the middle range. And so I think that like not everyone has this big change when they come to university, but most people, you know, at least 75% of people have some change in their network. So I guess like the point I'm trying to make is that change is normal. Everyone has some change. And so like as you're trying to navigate relationships with other people in university, be mindful that they also are going through changes in their life and that their idea of what a perfect social life looks like might be very different from yours. So yeah, like we just have to meet people where they are in terms of what they expect from university.
Amazing. Hina's just been thinking about other questions that are bouncing around, so we could pick up 2 of those as before we wrap up. I'll read them out for you. But for students who are trying to manage networks back home and at university, so thinking about international students in particular, how do you make space for everyone in the convoy without feeling distressed or feeling stretched? And is this a conversation to have with both sets of people?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think to a certain extent, everyone will have their pre-university network and their current network. For some people, it'll be a much wider gap between them. You know, like you were saying, international students or people who move. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for this, but I guess like spending some time thinking about what each relationship needs would probably be a good starting point. So like maybe your parents are part of the network back home. Your relationship with your parents will undoubtedly change when you move to university. So maybe having a conversation with them about what the expectations are, about how often you speak to them so they don't feel forgotten about, but also so that you can recognize that you are in this new environment, need to make new friends, whatever. So I do think that like almost taking like inventory of your relationships and thinking about like which are the ones that I think need a little more effort and that I need to put more time into, and which are the ones where like, you know, that person for sure is always going to be part of their life. They will understand that I'm going through this big change. And then thinking about like, what do you need personally? Because relationships are this like dynamic thing. And so sometimes in relationships you give a lot, sometimes you take a lot, and you just have to figure out which relationships you can kind of find the balance on. So I don't have an answer other than just like spending some time thinking about what relationships need more effort.
And I think you answered a bit of that question earlier on in actually just recognizing the convoy idea, recognizing that there might be a limit to your convoy. There might only be so many people that you're comfortable holding on in your network, right? And if you can be thinking about that, then we get to the point that Hina's picking up about distressed and stretched, that it's possible that actually you're trying to manage more relationships than you're comfortable holding. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Yeah.
That does make sense. And also that kind of goes to the two-way street thing. Like, are they trying to maintain the relationship also? Because yeah, like you only have a certain number of relationships you can keep afloat. So yeah, just bearing that in mind, and also like investing in relationships that invest in you, I think is just a really good way to think about relationships.
Yeah. And then another question, which was how do university expectations regarding friendships evolve for students who had poor experiences of friendships at school? Is there sort of does this pattern repeat, or perhaps having been someone that's had more difficult relationships at school, is the convoy fixed, or might it be a reflection of actually a lack of opportunity to have a more dynamic or flourishing social life than you might have capacity to hold?
I really like this question. So I think in terms of like research and evidence from my field of social network analysis, there's not anything that I know about this. So it's definitely something that we're still trying to figure out, and I think more people should be involved in. I think that when you're thinking of change in university as an opportunity, then certainly someone who's had a poor experience could view university as this opportunity to have different relationships, to have more supportive relationships. But certainly if you've had really poor experiences, then you're going to have some, you know, I don't want to say trauma because that's maybe not the right word. For some people, it could be trauma, but some negative experiences that then color your perceptions or your ability to form new relationships. So I think you could look at university as this new opportunity, but also, yeah, keeping in mind like your preferences, and so maybe not trying to just completely reinvent yourself, because that's not authentic to who you are. But certainly just because you went to a school where you were forced into these relationships where people treated you really poorly does not mean that university is going to be the same. It doesn't have to be. But there's not a lot of research like from the network perspective to kind of show what that transition looks like. Yeah.
It's a really interesting question. I'm just thinking from other areas of research that we can draw on there, and that when you've had difficult relationships, we know people can be more sensitive to possible criticism and possible critique. So you're sort of a bit more hyper aware, looking out for problems in relationships, which can be, you were talking earlier about I can't remember what the word was. Over-interpreting, that was it. Yeah. Which I guess can almost be a self-fulfilling pattern, that if we want to over-interpret, then we can read in the negativity that's in our mind that might not be there. It can be challenging. So it's sort of challenging yourself about what's real and what's in your mind. Is that negativity really there?
Yeah. Well, and I think like in some of my other research looking at networks, not necessarily just for students, but kind of across the life course and focusing on loneliness and social isolation, there's a lot of fear that people have that their network is too small, or that other people know that their network is too small. And so that is it's a very common thing, but most people have no idea what your social life actually looks like. People tend to have, different friendship groups, people that don't do everything together. And so just because you only have, 2 friends that you hang out with for the majority of your university time does not mean that you don't have this really big network elsewhere. And so I think people struggle to think of what other people think of them, and that, if you lack friends, or if that you're more of a loner or introvert type, that people are judging you for it. But especially in today's world where we have so many online relationships and people that we communicate with not face to face, it's only the tip of the iceberg. You really have no idea what someone's social life looks like. So I think that fear of, my convoy's too small or whatever it is, that just isn't necessarily true. You have no idea. And again, you might have someone who prefers a convoy of 20 people, but none of those are deep relationships. And if that doesn't work for you, if you really need deep relationships, then you should not have any envy of the person who has the 20 people that looks like they have all their best friends, because actually you have relationships that work for you. You don't need those 20 people. So I just think that self-comparison when it comes to relationships can be really, really problematic.
Indeed. Brilliant. Well, it feels like a deeply profound lesson to end on. Is let's try not to do the comparison thing.
Yeah,
it's really tricky.
Just do that. You'll be fine.
Emily, it's been wonderful chatting with you, and I'm fairly sure we could chat all afternoon, all day. But it's been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really nice. Okay.
Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
See you later. Bye.